Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for being here, and thanks David for the great introduction and for getting everyone comfortable with the space we're in. We are so excited to have Professor Anna Stavrianakis and Yasmin Luqman with us to help guide this discussion on the situation in Yemen and how we can work together to halt the continuous flow of arms and to support to the Saudi regime, who are just now leading the bombardment of Yemen, which has led to the world's worst humanitarian disaster. I think when we talk about the arms trade, it's such a large and a complex issue, but if we can think about it in the way that it's the business that profits from war, it thrives on destruction and suffering, then we can use that to shift public perception and challenge the UK government support, because the arms trade couldn't happen without the support of governments. The UK government is one of the world's biggest arms dealers. We look at Yemen, where Saudi forces are flying UK-made fighter jets and dropping UK-made bombs. This bombardment has been happening since 2015, so that's 5 years, where we've seen schools, hospitals, weddings and funerals all targeted, and thousands of people have lost their lives. So as David said, I'm the Scotland coordinator for CAAT, Campaign Against Arms Trades, and at CAAT we have challenged the UK government's arms sales to Saudi Arabia at the Supreme Court. We did win, and the UK government had to stop for a while, but just this summer Westminster decided that there were no patterns in breach of international humanitarian law, and that these were, and this is probably the worst part, isolated incidents. This week we had the UN presented with an internal report which highlights documented patterns in the attacks and calls for governments that are arming the Saudi-led coalition to immediately stop, because we are fueling this conflict. Our weapons are fueling this conflict. There are arms manufacturers across Scotland who are making weapons that are causing these deaths and all this destruction. At the very least, there are £6.3 billion worth of arms that have been sold from the UK to Saudi Arabia, and yet Westminster still claim that they have no hand in the crisis that's facing Yemeni people that our speakers will speak about in a little bit. But all of that isn't to say that here in Scotland we're completely innocent, that we're not complicit, because we look at Scottish Enterprise. It's a part of the Scottish Government, and they've given millions in funding to companies like Raytheon, who build the Pave Way Forward bombs that have been used against Yemeni people and caused unimaginable suffering. And right now we're looking at Highlands and Islands Enterprise, another part of Scottish Government. They're awarding funding to Lockheed Martin, who are the world's largest arms manufacturers, to utilise spaceports, weaponise them in Shetland and Sutherland in the north of Scotland. So, like I said, there are no innocent parties here. We need to come together now to resist this immoral, corrupt business. And I'm so glad that Anna and Yasmin are here this evening to widen our knowledge and inspire us to take action. And I'm sure David mentioned it, but as they're both speaking, we are having a small Q&A session in the middle of this evening. So if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat box. We'll try to collect them and make sure that they're answered in a little bit. But yeah, I just wanted to give you a sort of bit of background knowledge as to where we are in our campaigning against the arms trade and the situation in Yemen and what it's like for those people. But what I'll do is we'll get started with Anna. So, as I said, Professor Anna Stavrianakis is a Professor of International Relations at the University of Sussex. She has a book titled Taking Aim at the Arms Trade, NGO, Global Civil Society and World Military Order. Anna has also written a series of articles on UK arms exports to Saudi Arabia and the war in Yemen. So thank you so much for being here, Anna, and I'll let you take over.
Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you, David. Thank you for the invitation and the kind introduction, and thank you to everybody who's on the call for showing up on a Friday evening. It's really great to see people interested in participating in this sort of event to kind of educate ourselves and think about what sort of action we can take as citizens or residents of a country that is so intimately involved in the war. What I wanted to do in this provocation, as David so aptly put it, was to take up the theme of the Edinburgh World Justice Festival, which is World in Crisis, taking on the corporations. And so I want to do that in two parts. The first part, thinking about what is the nature of the crisis in Yemen, and then the second part, taking on the corporations and thinking about their relationship to the UK government, and then ending with what we might be able to do about that. So thinking about the nature of the crisis in Yemen, Emma has already told us, reminded us that Yemen has been labelled by the United Nations as the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. It's been reported that since the beginning of this conflict in March 2015, approximately 112,000 people have died as a direct result of hostilities, of whom around 12,000 are civilians. It is by now well documented that all sides to the war are committing violations of international law, including war crimes. But beyond the deaths directly resulting from hostilities, there is also widespread food insecurity, malnutrition and starvation. There is some debate about whether Yemen is on the brink of or experiencing famine, and the debate is only simply because there are technicalities around when a famine can officially be declared. But let there be no doubt, Yemen is in effect experiencing famine, and not because there isn't food, but because Yemen, a country that is already dependent on food imports, is being starved. People cannot afford to pay for food because their wages are not being paid. Food deliveries are being blocked by the warring parties. This is an active program of trying to starve a country into submission as a direct war strategy. Yemen is also experiencing the world's worst cholera outbreak since modern records began to be kept after the end of the Second World War. That's just one of the many communicable diseases that is spreading widely in Yemen, in part because of the people's poor health situations, but also the utter decimation of the healthcare infrastructure, again, as a direct strategy of the war. And now, on top of all of that, Yemen is part of the global COVID pandemic. But I've seen several reports when the first reports of the spread of COVID in Yemen came out, that there was a sense of, like, why now? Why would COVID be the thing that you get excited about in relation to Yemen when the population is already being made to suffer these illnesses and the healthcare infrastructure is being decimated in this way? So I wanted to give a few of those examples to help us think about the nature of the crisis in Yemen. But I think the main thing that I would want to say about this is that we run the risk in the UK of, when we hear about war zones, and actually I don't think we hear nearly enough about Yemen. Yemen has been massively underreported in the news, not least because of the UK's direct involvement in it. But when we do hear about Yemen, when there are pictures in the news, pictures on the TV, they are routinely of the starving baby, of the poor woman hunting through the rubble for the members of her family. And those images are themselves, I find, quite problematic. They are extremely depoliticizing, and they represent the Yemeni people as this kind of poor, helpless, suffering people without any agency, without any actual characteristics that they might be people that we might know or care about. So I think those kind of tropes, those images of starving children and humanitarian disaster, depoliticize what is in fact deeply political. Because this crisis is the active choice, it is the active strategy of those who are participating in the war, and that includes the UK as an arms supplier, its claims not to be involved in the war notwithstanding. So I think if there was one takeaway I would want people to think about in relation to the nature of that crisis, is that actually our response should be one not of sympathy, but of solidarity. So thinking about the second part of the theme, which is taking on the corporations. Who are the corporations? What are they doing? And how can we take them on? The main corporation involved in UK support for Saudi Arabia and the Saudi-led coalitions is BAE Systems. It's what is known as the prime contractor on UK-Saudi arms agreements. These date back to the 1980s in a series of agreements known as the Al-Yamamah deals, which were supplemented in the 2000s by the Al-Salam deals. The actual details of the agreements are largely secret, but if you're interested in this, Nicholas Gilby, who's closely associated with CAAT, has written a wonderful book called Deception in High Places, which has a website where you can see some of the detail that he's managed to get from the archives. BAE Systems make, in particular, the Typhoon and the Tornado aircraft that are being used by the Saudis. Raytheon make the bombs that go on them. But it's not just weapons. BAE Systems also provides engineering support in Saudi Arabia, and the RAF provides training, including in the UK. There have been some good recent reports by Phil Miller, who writes for Declassified, uncovering some of the detail of this. I think the key point I would want to make about this is that the UK's arms relationship with Saudi Arabia is a government-to-government agreement in which the state, the government, and the arms companies led by BAE Systems work together. So yes, officially, BAE Systems is a private company, but it's working directly on behalf of the UK state. It has a contract with the MOD. It's operating on behalf of the Ministry of Defence. So yes, we need to take on the corporations, but we also need to take on the state and the relationship between government and companies. One of the key effects of this relationship is a mutual deniability. So the government refuses to release information about or produced by BAE Systems on the grounds of commercial confidentiality. They say that they're a private company, they're operating in Saudi Arabia, it's not up to us, and it would be inappropriate for us to release information because it's commercially sensitive. Yet when you ask BAE Systems to release any information, they say, well, we operate within the bounds of the law, we operate within the bounds of UK policy, you'll need to ask the government, you'll need to ask the MOD. And so there's this very neat game of shielding against attempts at accountability that comes from that relationship. Campaign Against Arms Trade have found out that BAE Systems has sold £15 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia in the last 5 years, earning about £2.5 billion in revenue from sales to the Saudi military in that time. Saudi Arabia is BAE's third largest customer, behind the USA and the UK Ministry of Defence, and Saudi Arabia accounts for 40% of UK arms exports. So when the government says that arms exports are good for the economy and good for jobs, well, they're certainly good for BAE Systems, that much is sure. But the wider economic benefits are heavily disputed. Some local economies are indeed dependent on those jobs, and that would need direct state intervention to support a transition away from arms-related jobs. So how can the corporations and the government be taken on? I want to talk you through a couple of the different routes. The first and most fabulous is the way that Campaign Against Arms Trade took the government to court, launching a judicial review saying that the government's implementation of its own policy was irrational and therefore unlawful. And in June 2019, CAAT won an amazing legal victory. I did not dare even hope that they might win. And they did in June 2019. The Court of Appeal found in CAAT's favour, finding that the government had failed to adequately assess whether there was a pattern of past abuses by the Saudi-led coalition, and therefore it could not reasonably say whether there was in fact a clear risk of the misuse of weapons. What that meant was that the government was required to suspend issuing any new export licenses to Saudi Arabia. One of the important things to note to that as a kind of side caveat is that this was not a suspension of transfers under licenses that had already been granted. So there were lots of licenses that had already been made that stayed open, and deliveries were made under those. It's just that no new licenses could be granted, which is one of the interesting things about how companies might have felt about that they were actually they were able to continue doing their deliveries, but they weren't allowed to generate any kind of new business. And the second thing the Court of Appeal said was that the government had to retake its decisions, this time lawfully, correctly, i.e. the government had to assess whether there was a past pattern of breaches by the Saudi-led coalition. It took the government more than a year to do this review and was utterly silent about it. And, observers were wondering what was going on. And then this summer, a review, quote unquote, was announced in which the government found that there were only isolated incidents. This is what Emma referred to at the beginning. There were only isolated incidents of violations of international law, but they couldn't find any patterns. And if they couldn't find any patterns, then there was no clear risk. And if there's no clear risk, then we don't need to stop selling weapons. So the government has decided that it will resume licensing weapons to the Saudi-led coalition. This, whilst I was expecting the review to be self-serving, I was still quite shocked at how kind of front foot forward it was, how self-assured it was, at the complete refusal to engage with the myriad well-documented examples of violations. So I and many others were bitterly disappointed by that outcome. But I think we just need to wait and see what happens kind of legally, because it's still unclear how the government even got to that position, and it's currently refusing to answer any questions about how it got to that position. So that was a sweet high last year that ended in bitter disappointment this year. But activists have also been taking on the corporations directly in the courts. There's an NGO coalition that includes Muatana for Human Rights, a Yemeni organization supported by Campaign Against Arms Trade and others. They are taking a complaint to the International Criminal Court against arms companies, including BAE Systems, Raytheon, and some European suppliers, Leonardo, Airbus, Thales, amongst others. They are asking the International Criminal Court to investigate whether senior executives at the companies and or government officials may be responsible for aiding and abetting war crimes in Yemen. So I think the legal avenues are by no means closed. And I find it very interesting to see activists also taking on the companies directly. The second way in which the companies and the government can be taken on is through direct action. Trade unionists in France and Italy have done wonderful work in refusing to unload or refusing to allow dock ships that were bound for Yemen. We also have a strong tradition in the UK of direct action, much of which is supported by CAAT at arms factories in the UK. Another avenue is parliamentary scrutiny. There are some, admittedly fairly few, but some MPs who've been active in pressing the government, some as part of the parliamentary committees on arms export controls, others independently of that, in refusing to let the government off the hook and continually asking them questions about Yemen in Parliament. So what might we as activists or we as concerned citizens or residents be able to do? First, you may wish to write to your MP. There are templates on the CAAT website, or you can write in your own words. Look up your MP, see if they've spoken on arms issues. If they have, press them. If they haven't, ask them why not. See if they're on any of the committees. Are they on the committees on arms export controls? Are they on the Foreign Affairs Committee? Are they on the Defence Committee? I was checking just before we sort of came live. If we have anybody from West Dunbartonshire here, Martin Doherty Hughes is on the committees on arms export controls. You could join a trade union, be part of the movement for defence diversification, be part of the movement pressing for divestment and demilitarisation, especially if you have a background in science or engineering. Scientists for Global Responsibility are a fabulous resource in this regard. Start doing some research. Try and find out the supply chains. Emma mentioned the connection between Raytheon making the paveways and BAE Systems. Are there smaller companies who supply Raytheon? These things are tricky because the smaller the company, the more dependent they're going to be on kind of supporting people's livelihoods. And it's tricky, but starting those conversations as a community, I think is really valuable. Talk to your friends about moving away from sympathy and towards solidarity. Get people talking about why we don't hear more about Yemen and talking about how Yemen is portrayed in the media. And finally, find out more about Yemen itself. There are many Yemenis active on Twitter, on other social media, see if there are local solidarity groups or community groups to start making those connections so that we can hear about Yemen from people in Yemen in their own words. Thank you.
That was great, Anna. Thank you so much. I think that was really powerful. And just so everyone's aware, we are recording the presentations from Anna and Yasmin, and they will be available later, because I understand there's some people that weren't able to make it, and obviously with contributions as powerful as that and so many interesting bits and calls to action in there, and we want to be able to share those messages. I think so I'd shared a few links based on what Anna was saying. Someone had also asked if those can be emailed around. I'm sure we can collate them and make sure everyone has a link to each of them. Speaking about the legal challenge, there is a link there. We are currently assessing all available options. There should be an update for our supporters in the coming weeks. And also we do have a live action to email your MP to talk about the resuming of the arms sales as well. So please, I do encourage you to take that on. And specifically for Scotland, there will be an action coming up in the next couple of weeks as well around Saudi use of Scottish airspace for training. So a lot of things happening, but they'll be covered in the follow-up email. So what I'll do is I'll let Yasmin come in just now. So Yasmin is a British Yemeni activist with a Master's in International Relations from the University of Edinburgh. It was focused on challenges faced by female activists, journalists and political leaders in Yemen in the Arab Spring. She is trained in peacemaking, conflict resolution and gender inclusion, and we're so excited to hear from you, Yasmin. I know you've got a couple of fans that are here today as well.
Thank you so much for coming, family, and for everyone for spending your Friday evening listening to us, wanting to take action. It really means a lot, and we shouldn't not have to be here spending our Friday evening learning about why our government is complicit in the murder and destruction of Yemen. So I really appreciate that. And from the bottom of my heart, it means a lot. I wanted to firstly thank Anna. She's absolutely brilliant and is dedicating a lot of work to doing this. I wanted to pick up on a couple of points initially and then sort of connect it with what I'd planned to speak about just very quickly. So the first thing, which actually aligns quite well with one of the sort of key messages I'd like for you to take away, is the problematic imagery that is coming out, whether it's the media. I'm seeing it quite a lot more recently this year on social media as well, of these starving kids and just sort of this like helpless sort of sense. And it's really awful to see that. I think it desensitizes us from the violence and the pain that is happening. And so on that, I think it's really important for us to consider sort of the like white saviorism, firstly, and how we get around that and don't sort of succumb to that, to be able to show solidarity and not just sympathy, because it is very easy, and it is certainly a good initial step to donate to great causes. But if you just sort of scroll past that photo that you see, or read through the article that you read through just very quickly, maybe donate and then forget about it, that doesn't make lasting change, and that doesn't actually sort of target those who are absolutely complicit, which is the UK government. And I'm in Scotland, so the Scottish government is absolutely complicit as well. And I see we have a lot of supporters from Edinburgh as well, so I can talk a bit about how the Edinburgh Council is complicit. And some of the arms companies, that even one of them, I can see Leonardo just from my window. That's quite disturbing. So that's one of the things we really need to sort of firstly stray away from, this idea of white saviorism, and encourage solidarity with Yemenis who are doing amazing work on the ground, rather than sort of viewing it as like, oh, that's just happening over there in the world and it doesn't affect us, because it does. So that was the first sort of point I wanted to pick up from Anna. The second thing is the mutual deniability, and no one's taking claim for the atrocities that are happening in Yemen. One big thing that I know is happening in Scotland as well is a failure to do checks on the arms companies and the factories. I think it's Raytheon that has not been checked since 2016. Which is appalling considering how complicit they are in the airstrikes. That's absolutely disturbing. And so the sort of safeguarding is just not being taken care of in that respect. And then finally, and I will touch on this with women activists, Mwatan is amazing. Definitely follow them and just read the resources that they have compiled to educate yourselves as well. So sort of on that, I would really like to emphasize sort of my research that I've done so far, which is focused on Yemeni women activists. I wrote my master's dissertation on this. So this is something I do enjoy speaking about, but also sort of seeing how it's changed in the last year since I completed and graduated. So one sort of big thing is, again, sort of changing our mindset, is to focus rather than on women as a binary. Either they are oppressed, they have no voice, they're not liberated, or they are like secular, liberated, they're posting and out in the streets, because that's not the way it is, and it's not the way it is in any country. Women occupy a variety of different roles, and in Yemen, they're incredibly resilient. There's so many different organizations where women have sacrificed so much and are using their knowledge to really take like an intersectional feminist lens on this. So yeah, I wanted to sort of list a couple of really good organizations to research and to follow as well on social media is quite a good way to learn. But Muwatana for Human Rights is excellent. They are absolutely resilient. The Mothers of Abductees Association, they're formed by female relatives of forcibly disappeared men in different parts of Yemen. And they actually operate in Houthi-controlled zones as well, which is an added sort of level of danger that they're attempting to overcome. The Women's Solidarity Network is excellent as well. It's a coalition of 250 women and women-led organizations working to protect women and build peace in Yemen. And the Peace Track Initiative, which advocates for the inclusion of women in the peace process. And that's been incredibly effective because women have striven for a 30% inclusion in the peace process, which if they don't get there, they are still pushing for it. And their voices were heard in the Stockholm conference in 2018, and they really, really pushed for a gendered approach to peace. So that's what I wanted to discuss sort of on the sort of women's activism in Yemen. And the final point, and I think Anna touched on this as well, is at the center, the Yemeni civilians are the victims of this violence. And we absolutely cannot trust the Saudi-led coalition, the Houthis, the de facto Yemeni government, the UK government. I was raised in the US, the US government as well, I'll call out, or the UN really to resolve this crisis, because they really do not have the idea of peace and justice for Yemen, for all Yemenis. At the center, they have sort of a capitalist agenda, they have a warmongering agenda, and they're not going to be the ones who are going to resolve this. It's going to be Yemenis. I think that's probably a good place to stop.